What was the meaning and purpose of the 10 plagues of Egypt? The plagues were 10 disasters sent upon Egypt by God to convince Pharaoh to free the Israelite slaves from the bondage and oppression they had endured in Egypt for 400 years. When God sent Moses to deliver the children of Israel from bondage in Egypt, he promised to show his wonders as confirmation of Moses' authority. This confirmation was to serve at least two purposes: to show the Israelites that the God of their fathers was alive and worthy of their worship, and to show the Egyptians that their gods were nothing.
Remember that line of reasoning that he uses right there. To show the Egyptians that their gods were nothing. It'll come up later.
The god of the Nile, Isis, goddess of the Nile, and Khnum, guardian of the Nile. The Nile was also believed to be the bloodstream of Osiris, who was reborn each year when the river flooded. The river, which formed the basis of daily life and the national economy, was devastated, as millions of fish died in the river and the water was unusable. The second plague, bringing frogs from the Nile, was a judgment against Hecate, the frog-headed goddess of birth. Frogs were thought to be sacred and not to be killed. God had the frogs invade every part of the homes of the Egyptians, and when the frogs died, their stinking bodies were heaped up in offensive piles all throughout the land.
Remember that little phrase as well, whenever he said that the frogs' bodies were heaped up in offensive piles, basically stating that to them a dead god or a representation of their dead god was offensive. Remember that, little Jim.
The third plague, gnats, was a judgment on Set, the god of the desert. The fourth plague, flies, was a judgment on Uatchet, the fly god. In this plague, God clearly distinguished between the Israelites and the Egyptians, as no swarms of flies bothered the areas where the Israelites lived. The fifth plague, the death of livestock, was a judgment on the goddess Hathor and the god Apis, who were both depicted as cattle. The sixth plague, boils, was a judgment against several gods over health and disease: Sekhmet, Sunu, and Isis. The seventh plague, hail, attacked Nut, the sky goddess, Osiris, the crop fertility god, and Set, the storm god. Before God brought the next plague, he told Moses that the Israelites would be able to tell their children of the things they had seen God do in Egypt and how it showed them God's power.
Remember this one as well, that Hashem told them that they would be able to tell their children of what happened, because that's actually really important and very symbolic of what we're going to explain later.
The eighth plague, locusts, again focused on Nut, Osiris, and Set. The ninth plague, darkness, was aimed at the sun god, Re, who was symbolized by Pharaoh himself. For 3 days, the land of Egypt was smothered by an unearthly darkness, but the homes of the Israelites had light. The 10th and last plague, the death of the firstborn males, was a judgment on Isis, the protector of children. In this plague, God was teaching the Israelites a deep spiritual lesson that pointed to Christ. Unlike the other plagues, which the Israelites survived by virtue of their identity as God's people, this plague required an act of faith by them. God commanded each family to take an unblemished male lamb and kill it. The blood of the lamb was to be smeared on the top and sides of the doorways, and the lamb was to be roasted and eaten that night. Any family that did not follow God's instructions would suffer in the last plague. God described how he would send the destroyer through the land of Egypt, which orders to slay the firstborn male of every household, whether human or animal. The only protection was the blood of the lamb on the door. When the destroyer saw the blood, he would pass over that house and leave it untouched. This is where the term Passover comes from. Passover is a memorial of that night in ancient Egypt when God delivered his people from bondage. 1 Corinthians 5:7 teaches that Jesus became our Passover when he died to deliver us from the bondage of sin. While the Israelites found God's protection in their homes, every other home in the land of Egypt experienced God's wrath as their loved ones died. This grievous event caused Pharaoh to finally release the Israelites. By the time the Israelites left Egypt, they had a clear picture of God's power, God's protection, and God's plan for them.
We see very clearly that there are Christians who recognize that the events leading up to Pasach were a thumb in the eye to the gods of Egypt. This video was just one of many that you can find online concerning that. Now, Christians are amazingly talented for finding parallels for everything and anything. So, looking back at the highlights of this video, how did they miss the most important one? Let's go back and piece together the logic that the narrator used. The first line of deduction and reasoning from the narrator was to show the Egyptians their gods were nothing. The second deduction and reasoning was that the dead carcasses of the frogs, which were a god, was offensive to the Egyptians. Third, we find the narrator saying that all these events would be for Israel to tell their children in the future. Now notice how he tries to immediately tie the 10th plague to Jesus. He states that the Jews survived the first 9 plagues because of their identity alone, but the last one would require an act of faith. But what was the act of faith? What do they need to have faith in, and why? After looking at all of this, we see that everything involved with these plagues was in one way or another tied to the Egyptian gods, just like the narrator said. My question, though, is why did the narrator not say a word about the lamb? Before we get into that, let's go ahead and first take a look at the stipulations of Pasach that are outlined in Exodus 12. Exodus 12:3, we see that it was to be on the 10th day of the first month. Exodus 12:3-4, the lamb was to be selected on the size of the family. Exodus 12:5, the lamb must be of the first year and without blemish, taken from the sheep or the goats. Exodus 12:6, it shall be kept for 14 days, and then the entire congregation must kill it at dusk. Exodus 12:7, the blood must be put on the doorposts of the house. Exodus 12:9-11, you must eat it dressed to go. It must be cooked in fire, and anything that is left until the morning must be burnt in the fire. Exodus 12:13, when Hashem saw the blood, he would not let the destroyer hurt the people in that house. Exodus 12:14, 17, and 26-27, it is to be celebrated forever throughout all of Israel, to remember that Hashem passed over the fathers of Israel. If we are to take the logic and deduction used by the narrator so far, we see each part of God's actions was not just to free Israel, but to diminish the Egyptian gods as well. I believe everybody is in agreement on this. The dead bodies of the animals that the Egyptians considered gods would be an offense to them, and all these events would be used to remind the future generations of Israel of what had happened in the past whenever Hashem founded their nation. So if there must be a parallel between every other aspect of this and the Egyptian gods, then there must be an equal parallel to the Pasach lamb and the Egyptian gods. Right? Right. There it is. Let me introduce you to the Egyptian god Khnum. Khnum was one of the oldest gods of Egypt. Some say he was the oldest. While he's definitely not on top of the hierarchy, he is still massively important to the Egyptians. When I say important, to put it into perspective, they found over 2,000 mummified sheep heads in Ramses II's tomb. Khnum was the great potter, the creator of people, and the chief god of the source of the Nile River. Let me say that again, the source of the Nile River. Without that river, Egypt turns into a complete desert. It's like Iraq 2.0. The Egyptians directly linked worship of Khnum with fertility and abundance that came when the Nile River would flood each year. So we find that the Egyptians revered sheep as a god, and along with female cows, goats, and sometimes pigs, they were not to be trifled with, let alone eat. Which is why we see clearly in Bereshit 46:34 that the Egyptians viewed shepherds as an abomination. First, it's because it was man taking dominance over what the Egyptians considered to be a god. And now this was followed by the act that 400 years before Yosef took his place in Egypt, Hyksos, the shepherd king, invaded and conquered Lower Egypt. Egypt was also a more agricultural land. As you can imagine, shepherds and their flocks, well, that directly threatened that. Because when a sheep god comes up and decides that he's going to eat your wheat, I mean, what are you going to say to him? You gonna tell them no? Armed with this information, we see why in Shemot 8:25-27, Moshe did not want to do sacrifice anywhere that an Egyptian could possibly see them. As the narrator pointed out, the carcasses of the dead frogs would have been offensive. If the carcasses of a dead frog was found to be offensive, how much more offensive do you think it would have been if the Egyptians saw people that they considered to be their slaves sacrificing their primary creator god? Now remember how the narrator said that Am Yisrael didn't need to do anything for the first 9 plagues, but they received a pass on that one because of their lineage. But they would, however, need to have faith for the 10th and final plague. Did you ask yourself why they needed faith for that final plague? Many would say, and many do say, that they would need faith that the destroyer would leave them alone if they slayed the lamb and put the blood on their posts. But why would they need faith in that when they knew Hashem was in control of the destroyer? God had shown to be in control of everything else up to that point. Why would they doubt that he could, or that he would be willing to control the destroyer? Or would they need faith that God's other created free will beings wouldn't kill them? Because not only were they about to kill an astronomical number of lambs, which the Egyptians believed to be their creator and sustainer god, but they were also going to eat and then desecrate the body in front of them and basically use the blood as a citywide art contest, signifying that the Jews killed their god Lamb Chop. If Moshe was afraid for Am Yisrael to just do a normal sacrifice in front of the Egyptians, how much more concerned should they be that they were playing connect the dots with lamb's blood? So let's tie this all together, shall we? Hashem wanted to save Israel and diminish the Egyptian gods at the same time. He achieved this through the 10 plagues. Each plague directly portrayed an aspect of the Egyptian gods. The final blow was to slaughter the god who brought life, fertility, and abundance to the land of Egypt. The blood was a sign that Am Yisrael trusted God more than they feared the Egyptians. And the story to tell their children is just that. When faced with danger, they trusted Hashem and killed and ate the false god of the Egyptians, and by doing so, Hashem preserved them. The Pasach lamb represented a false creator god, Chanum. And finally, the Pasach lamb was not a sin sacrifice. It had nothing to do with sin.
So, they can recognize the parallels between the plagues and the gods of Egypt. They seem to recognize all of that sincerely. But they can't recognize the connection between the Pasach lamb and the Egyptian god Chanum, the ram god. Nor do they recognize that Pesach is a reminder to Am Yisrael, not to the church. You see, they've shown that they're intelligent. So this isn't a matter of not being able to see, this is a matter of not wanting to see. Tell me I'm wrong.